This cold morning in India to Delhi to welcome Professor Ray Fisman as the first plenary speaker for our conference. He needs no introduction, but let me say a few words anyways. Professor Ray Fisman is the Slater Family Professor in Behavioral Economics at Boston University. Ray works on a large diversity of issues. In fact, some of my priors about him, I realized that they're published way beyond just those issues. So pretty vast variety of issues, which I guess when you struggle to club things, you always call them institutions because everything can kind of come in there. So let me say that he works on institutions, looks at, of late, looks at political actors, bureaucrats, but more generally at roles of social ties, issues of favoritism, political connections, but I mean, a lot more than just that. As we all know, he has published extensively at the AER, JP, GI, I mean, to name some of the few recent prominent journals. While a lot of his recent focus of his published work has been on China, he's also worked on India and Africa. So I guess he brings a global perspective on many issues. And so today he will speak on the costs and benefits of social ties, which draws from various papers. It's a pity we don't have him here. We hope to get him here someday. Physically, there are a lot of parking fines here. I mean, there are many people not paying, so there's a lot of work you can do. I'm sure all of us will benefit from his talk. So Ray, the floor is all yours. We'll try to go, so you speak, and then if there are burning questions, I guess I'll allow them. Otherwise, because it's hard to figure out what a burning question is, just looking at someone's name, but we'll figure it out. So I guess 1 hour, and then we'll leave 15 minutes for questions.
You can see my screen now?
Yes, it's up.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much. First, thank you very much for this invitation, this opportunity to talk about the costs and benefits of social ties, but I will do it from kind of a very self-referential perspective. So I'm going to talk about work that I have done in this area, and I just want to flag up front that I do not mean to suggest that this is anything close to the sum total or even the necessarily by any means the most important work on this topic, but it is certainly the work I know best. To kind of follow on the introduction, the way I came into this topic, in a sense, is my roots are in corruption and thinking about favor exchange from that perspective. And so, that was where I began to think about social ties, but I think much more broadly, I see them in the spirit of, as I will describe in just a moment, the basis of essentially any economic transaction, and thus it is hard to think about economic relations without also considering social relations. I will also say, just to flag again, I will talk about India, I will talk about China. Those are the two settings I'll focus on. A lot of my work these days focuses on corruption and favor exchange in the US. And when you described my work as focusing on India and China, I kind of wish I had, and Africa, I kind of wish I had inserted some material from the US and how we do things here as a point of comparison, but that will have to wait for an in-person visit. So I said a moment ago, I've come around to kind of seeing much of economic relations as being grounded in social relations. I'm hardly the first to make this observation. As an understatement, a quite cited article on the embeddedness of economic relations. The sociologist Mark Granovetter talked about the over-socialization of his own field, that they were obsessed with everything being about social relations, while at the same time he contrasted this with our own field, which was hopelessly under-socialized. And I should say that Granovetter wasn't the only one to make this observation. Elinor Ostrom had this wonderful line in talking about how essentially game theory went astray in kind of thinking about participants in some attempt at solving some common resource problem, these unitary actors that never communicate, that only kind of try to make inferences about what the likely course of actions are of others in this quote game, whereas those who are trying to solve these common resource problems get together and discuss it. That is, game theory also from Ostrom's perspective lacked this social dimension. So Granovetter, on the one hand, seeing sociology as over-socialized, everything is about social relations. Economics, under-socialized, doesn't really fully consider social relations at all, proposed a middle ground. That is, social relations were not, as sociologists often seemed to argue, destiny, but they are the essential infrastructure within which economic relations exist. And we have to account for this social infrastructure in thinking about the economic exchange that is overlaid on them, or to use Granovetter's terminology, economic exchange is embedded in a set of social relations. So implicit in this formulation, we need to account for the social forces that, and the social structure that underlies economic transactions. Okay, so in the course of the next 45, 50 minutes, I will talk about, like, I'm an empirical person, I will give a series of empirical examples that I hope will illustrate the way that economic actions are not just affected, but essentially governed by social relations. And I will, through much of the discussion, focus on the basic trade-off. But when I get to some of the work later on China, the Chinese bureaucracy, I'll kind of, there's only so much you can get to in 45 or 50 minutes. I'll have emphasized that, well, there's more to the role of social relations in economics than just this basic trade-off. But for now, we will think about the trade-off as between, on the one hand, reducing, if you like, transaction frictions, and in particular information frictions, is a benefit of social ties, closer social ties. So it allows us to better inspect ex ante potential transaction partners. It also helps with ex post information frictions in the sense of being better able to enforce contracts. And we trade that off against favoritism. That is, I choose to interact with someone because he is, because of my social ties to him, rather than because of the efficiency of that transaction. Why we care? Well, in a sense, we can just go back to the previous slide. And if you really take this overarching framing of Granovetter, that all economic relations are embedded in a social context that helps to kind of define these economic relations, of course we have to, of course we'll end up caring. But the focus, and this is, I suppose, a nod to the theme of the conference, growth and development, these forces will affect whether resources, whether physical or human, capital are allocated efficiently. So who gets which resources? So the allocation of physical capital, which is what I'll start with. And if you like, who gets ahead? And you can think about that as, in some sense, the direction of human capital. I will say, just before I go on, I know you're supposed to save questions to the end, but if you do have, would like me to clarify something in terms of what I'm saying, please do feel free to interject. Okay, so
yes. There's someone in the attendees who wants to
okay, that was quick. Maybe I should have waited to say that till I was a little further along. Go ahead.
Right. So you can talk, I think. Sorry about this. Well, I mean, maybe you can just carry on.
Okay. So save the question, I guess, for later. Okay, so I am going to, if you like, think about two related questions. The first is, does it affect allocation decisions, like the quantity? Can we observe kind of a difference in allocation as a result of social ties? Then we'll try to say something about whether the resultant allocative consequences are good or bad from some welfare or efficiency, according to some welfare or efficiency benchmark. There will be some cases where we have an easier time saying this than others. Now, maybe to kind of jump to the rather unsatisfying conclusion, I am going through the various examples that I've picked for this talk, partly because, if I actually get through it all, it sort of represents the sum total of my own work on this topic, but it also emphasizes that there is, unsurprisingly, no single answer that social ties are good, social ties are bad. To strip it down to rather simplistic terms, if you think about the preceding trade-off, if you imagine that that was the sum total of the consequences of social ties for economic relations, in some contexts you could imagine that one of these effects dominates, and in other settings, the other effect will dominate. So, we can't say, connections are good, social ties are good, social ties are bad. This is very much a setting-specific question. And I suppose by going through a number of these empirical exercises, we can start to think a bit more about, first of all, what are the empirical approaches to studying these things, but also, are there any general lessons that that we might be able to extract beyond the no single answer type of inconclusive conclusion. Okay, so the goal of the presentation is to, first of all, emphasize that very plausibly there are potentially positive and negative consequences, and I'm going to focus on China and India. So I'll go through a couple of papers on Indian banking, and then time permitting, a range of papers on China. Even in the same broad institutional setting, you'll see that you can, in a sense, flip the sign. Okay, but I do think it's instructive in a way how and why the sign flips, why in some cases tighter social connections seem to be a benefit, and in others they seem to be a liability. And again, there is a methodological element to this, in that going to try to give you a sense of the methodologies that we've employed to try to identify the role of social ties. Okay, so throughout, there are going to be two kind of parallel methodological topics that naturally arise. First of all, you have to measure connections. And second, there's the standard problem of identification, as we'll see. The cross-section here, looking at some economic outcome as a function of a cross-section of social ties, is in ways that you can probably guess is not going to be very informative. Okay, so in terms of measurement, like naturally when I look at, then this is another reason why India versus China, I think, is a nice pair of a nice set of offers a nice set of comparisons. You know, we'll focus on religious and caste associations in India. You know, religion is sufficiently irrelevant in China for most of the country that they know in the Chinese household finance survey, they no longer ask about religion. Okay, so it's kind of not a first order source of identification. The second point I want to highlight in terms of identifying social ties is that we're limited to the things that we can easily see. And so we'll study the social ties where we have like some readily identifiable link between individuals. And that may have very different implications from the ones that are hard for us to see. And if I get to selection into the Chinese political elite, I'll have a way of really, I think, a case where I can really emphasize how we probably would get a very different answer if we looked at the consequences of social ties that we could not see, as opposed to the ones that are easily observable to us as well as the people of China. In terms of outcomes, it will be useful because, going back to our objective, we would like to be able to say something about whether social ties lead to social welfare improving or social welfare damaging outcomes. So it'll be useful to consider contexts in which there's something for which we have some plausible social welfare ranking. Okay, and there'll be a couple of papers I'll talk about which probably have this this property. Okay, this will allow us to say something about whether, like, almost by definition, if individuals are engaging in the sorts of favor exchange that will emerge, or exchange, need not say favor exchange, that I document here, the individuals benefit, but we'll try to say something about whether there's some societal cost. Okay, so in terms of moving to identification, again, thinking about individuals exploiting social ties for benefit, almost by definition, assignment can't be random. So first of all, the empirical approaches that I'll talk about here are imperfect. So we will not have, in general, if you like, an instrument for social connections. What we'll take advantage of is either some plausible benchmark, and I'll come to that when I talk about some of the China work, against which to compare the transactions that take place in the presence of close social ties, or in the case of the very first paper that I talk about, exploit kind of discrete changes around turnover or some event that shocks the value of ties. We can look at what happens in the aftermath of that. The second implication, and it relates, or it is first cousin to, the lamppost problem that I talked about a moment ago, that we can only look at the social ties, that the effect of the social ties that we can in some way proxy for in the data. So we may be missing a lot of what is important about social ties in our empirical work. The second implication is that we're going to look at effectively exploit turnover within a panel rather than the cross-section, which essentially throws away a lot of variation that may be relevant to the overall consequences of social ties, but it's just hard to identify. Okay, in the sense that the cross-sectional variation, as we'll see shortly, is kind of hard to interpret. So just to give you some preview of the papers that I'll talk about in the rest of the talk, just looking at the time, I am sure I will get through, I'll get through these two, and which are two related papers on Indian banking. And then I would like to be able to talk about these two, one on social ties and Chinese science, and to contrast that with social ties and selection. You can think about this as also selection, social ties and selection into Chinese scientific elite, and social ties and selection into China's political elite. And we'll see that the selection effects there are really quite different. You can also contrast these in the sense that the papers on India will be about credit allocation. Okay, so the allocation, who gets what. And there are definitely implications for who gets resources, as we'll see, but these are a bit more about who gets ahead. So who gets to be in the Chinese scientific elite, who gets to be in the Chinese political elite. Okay, let me just pause if there are any questions in terms of the big picture motivation, because at this point I'll turn to specific papers. And I should say, and I should have opened with this, I did notice that the other plenary speakers are talking about, are presenting single papers, and that would be one option, but I thought it might be in the spirit of kind of giving an overview of a topic. I'm going to try to cram a few papers into this.
So I have a quick question, Ray.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't keep up with the literature, but I've seen Daniel present a couple of these papers. But nevertheless, the question is, do you view these as attributes of individuals, or do you think of this as a policy decision of individuals? Is this like genetic, or is this a policy choice of individuals?
So it is hard to separate the two. And certainly I'm not going to say anything that neatly does so. I think when this does go back a little bit to the identification and, or sorry, the measurement and identification questions around the endogenous social ties are going to be ones that are harder for us to see. So there are well-known of the so-called Shanghai Gang, the Chinese Communist Youth Gang, these, if you like, cliques within Chinese politics, where you would think of those as being much more endogenously formed social connections. But the ones that are easier for us to see here, like the readiest social tie, or the most readily measurable social tie in China, is going to be hometown. Okay, so that's something that I don't think I'd call it genetic destiny, but I would essentially call it social destiny, that you're born in Shanghai or you're not. It's not something, unless you're going to take it back generations, it's something that you're endowed with, as opposed to something that you choose to form. Yeah, I think that in a way, there's some slippage in the sense that people can choose to identify more or less strongly with a particular social group. So you can choose to be an active member of a hometown association, to continue with that example, or you can kind of make your own way, or you can emphasize your college connections. So it's a mixture of the two, and there's going to be at least some black boxiness to what I'll talk about when I talk about each of these papers, because I'm just going to, in the end, have a measure of whether we share some background attribute and some outcome variable. I'm not going to say anything about I'm certainly not going to say anything about why that may have come to be the salient form of social connection in China or elsewhere, though there are certainly books devoted to this topic. Just kind of taking as given that this is the source of connection, and seeing how that affects some outcome of interest. I'm not sure of how far that goes in answering your question.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks a lot. No, that's okay.
Okay, so the first paper that I'll talk about is with Daniel Parvisini and Vikrant Vig. And this is, I believe, the oldest paper. Yes, it's the oldest paper actually by quite a wide margin, a wider margin than these publication dates would suggest. The oldest paper that I'll talk about here. So I'm going to try to go through with each of these examples, kind of thinking about how do we measure social ties? What's the outcome? How does that help us assess social welfare? How do we identify the effect? And hopefully some patterns will emerge. Okay, so we measure social ties based on religion and caste affiliation. I will, again, what I want to emphasize here is that there will be kind of an obvious contrast across settings in how we think about capturing social ties. That's emphasis number one. Emphasis number two is we are, referring back to the question, we are essentially forced to rely on things that are easily identifiable and codable. This is codable and coded for us based on bank records. Okay, so the setting is a large Indian bank. The social ties are between a loan officer and borrowers. And so that gives us an outcome that has some allocative consequences associated with it, in the sense of we ultimately observe, was this a good loan or a bad loan by some measure, which tells us something about maybe was the bank loan officer better able to identify or enforce a loan agreement, or was the loan officer showing leniency towards someone with whom he feels some connection? Okay, and in terms of identification, bank loan officers are not randomly assigned. They're not randomly assigned for all sorts of reasons. I believe in our data, they're not allowed to be assigned ever to their home district for reasons of corruption. And but they do experience frequent rotation, also potentially for reasons of corruption. Okay, so what that gives us is constant churn in which bank loan officer is located in which branch. And we observe these discrete transitions from Muslim branch loan officer to Hindu branch loan officer, Hindu branch loan officer to Parsi bank loan officer. There are very few of those. And so you can kind of think about this as having a standard event study type design where we're mostly interested in these transitions from, say, Muslim to Hindu. And we can then look at what happens to lending to Muslim borrowers in this branch versus Hindu borrowers in this branch. Okay, so here is the main event plot relative to the arrival of a new branch loan officer. This is an event plot of credit allocation to borrowers who are of the same group, whether religion or within Hindu, same caste. Credit allocation to borrowers who are from the incoming branch manager's group. So for example, suppose this were a Muslim transition from Muslim to Hindu, or actually Muslim, Hindu, general caste. This would be lending to Hindu general caste borrowers. Okay, so when someone from your group comes in, there is a discrete increase in lending to your group. And we see quite reassuringly the symmetric result where, let's just take this general caste transition to Hindu, or sorry, general caste transition to Muslim. This would be lending to Hindu general caste borrowers. Okay? So it is relatively high while they have a general caste loan officer in the branch. When he leaves, you get this 4 percentage point decline. So a not small by some measure decline. Okay, so that's telling us that there is a quantity effect. Now the quantity effect is consistent with both favoritism as well as better screening and enforcement. Either way, if the in-group loan officer is able to better assess credit applications from within his group, better able to enforce credit contracts from within his group, then of course he'll give more loans to people from within his group. If he simply favors for reasons, it's the nature of his preferences, he shows favoritism toward people in his group, he'll also make more loans to people within his group. So the way we will try to, there's much more in the paper on this, both in terms of what we do to try to draw this distinction, but also the limits of what we can learn from what I'm about to describe. But the basic way we'll try to draw this distinction is we'll look at whether the loans are good loans. How do we know whether a loan is a good loan? Well, it depends on whether it eventually went into default. So this captures the fraction of loans that go into default 1 year later as a function of whether the loan was made by a same group borrower. So the coefficient here is negative. I will say, and whenever we talk about these results, we can make this observation. We did not expect the sign to go this way. Okay, so we expected the quantity effect. We also, like our priors were that we would see a favoritism effect. And rather than a favoritism effect, we observe something that looks more like better information and better enforcement. Okay? Defaults go down when a loan is made from within the group. Okay, so to briefly summarize, cultural closeness increases the quantity of credit, which is consistent with both favoritism and reduced information frictions. But it also increases the quality of credit, which suggests that, and we always end up with these sorts of qualifications, suggests that at least in a static environment, cultural closeness improves allocative efficiency. Now,
can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, was that 0.003 the standard error on that estimate? So that's like, so it's like is that like, I'm unable to see it very well, but it's like really significant, or is it like borderline significant?
I mean, this was back in the days when you put stars. So this is literally cut and paste from the paper. This is back in the days when you put stars. So the 2 stars means 5% significance. It is not, yeah. I'm not sure what more to say. So, you know, it had a p-value of probably, I don't know.
Yeah, the reason I bring that up is, I mean, to most Indians, and I can't speak for most Indians, but to whatever experience I have had or knowledge I have, I would say that they would expect the sign to go the other way around.
Yeah.
And I think with a very strong prior.
Yep.
And again, I don't want to speak for everybody, but that would be my sense of it. But that's why I bring up the standard error issue.
I note that when I presented these results, and even I said, whenever we present these results, we say this was not our prior. Okay, so just to be clear on that, like I don't claim to have any deep insight into you know, the nature of intergroup relations in India or really anywhere outside. It's the nature of these things that, you know, you need kind of some more direct context. And as I said, like all 3 of us expected the sign to go the other way. It's we have looked across many years what might or might not be wrong with this, and you know, this is the effect we find. I think what I will say is that the existence of a negative coefficient, and this is kind of a bridge to the next set of results I want to talk about, is by no means inconsistent with tremendous animus between castes or between religions. It's just saying that there is, in this case, there is an offsetting benefit in terms of the efficiencies, allocative efficiencies associated with better selection, better loan selection, better loan enforcement. Okay, we can't really make so clean a distinction between selection versus enforcement, which is why I don't plan to get into it here. So it's not to deny the existence of these animosities. It's to say that there may exist offsetting efficiencies. And so, yeah, I'm happy to consider and entertain the mistakes that exist in the empirics of this paper, but the negative coefficient is what pops out, and it goes again.
I'm sorry, I'll just interrupt. So you have about 20 minutes left. So I request everyone now not to ask, let him finish. We have.
Okay. No, the fault is mine, because when people ask questions, I
no, of course.
Gave longer answers than perhaps is
so we'll bail you out.
Yeah.
So my request to everyone is just leave the questions to
okay.
We only
okay. So I, in the spirit of moving on, I will not give the many caveats that that exist around kind of interpreting this as social welfare improving, or at least allocative efficiency improving result. Okay, this was what I was getting at with the my response to the previous comment. It does not imply an absence of favoritism, merely, and I shouldn't say merely, but that in this case, they're dominated by reduced information frictions. So in a follow-up paper with a student of Vikrant's, and two former students of Vikrant's, plus also Vikrant, we look at a shock to favoritism, a shock to animosity that potentially isolates the animosity channel, the animosity rather consequence of social ties. Okay, so it tries to answer the distinct but related question, which is about the formation of and persistence of outgroup animosity, of animus towards the other. Okay. We're not the only ones to be working on this topic, as I mentioned earlier. This is motivated in part by the really striking findings going back to Easterly and Levine, where if you take at face value the cross-sectional decomposition of why Africa is poor, a lot of it can be attributed to ethnic divisions. Much more recent work, Jonas Hjort in his job market paper had these really striking results on the productivity consequences of intergroup frictions between different ethnic groups in Kenya. So in this paper, and I'll go through it relatively briefly, so I at least get to talk about some of the China stuff. We focus on Hindu branch managers, which is a vast majority of the cases. And the variation here is not the religion of the branch manager, but whether the branch manager was exposed to religious violence at some point in his youth. And we take that as kind of the shock to outgroup animosity. So without getting into the details of how this is measured, you can see the paper for that, a riot experience dummy, and you can parameterize this in various ways, leads to, and you want to think about it much as with much the same identification as what I described for the previous paper. You have a branch manager. These are all Hindu branch managers. You have one that comes in who's exposed to Hindu-Muslim violence in his youth. You get a shift away from Muslim borrowers and towards Hindu borrowers. You see no effect on other borrowers. It need not be that this is insignificant. It could have been that there's a shift towards in-group at the expense of all out groups. But here it seems a pure shift from Muslim to Hindu. This is just the event plot. I'll skip it in the interests of time. Now here, we can again think about the quality of lending as a measure, as an indication of favoritism. And you again see that, because if it's information, you expect better loans. If it's favoritism, you expect worse loans. A riot-exposed manager gives worse loans, better loans, less likely to default to Muslim borrowers. But there's no effect of riot exposure for borrowers who are not Muslim. You can split it by Hindu versus others, and you get the same thing. Riot-exposed managers, you can kind of imagine the model that this would invoke, that they set a higher threshold for lending to Muslim borrowers. Those default less relative to lending to Hindus and others. Let me skip this. Okay, so to briefly summarize again, oh no, there was a reason why I wanted to mention this. Seems to be true no matter how many years how many years ago the exposure to violence was. So you can kind of think about this as relating to or building on the work of Hjort, where he's looking at electoral violence in 2008 in Kenya and looking at the effects on group productivity across a number of months or as long as a year, if I remember correctly. Here we're looking at much longer lasting consequences, at least across the course of loan officers' careers. These animosities lead to much longer lasting economic divisions, potentially with negative social welfare consequences, in the sense of Muslims having lesser access to capital. Okay. This does not capture the sum total consequences of intergroup animosities, which on average might be canceled out by the efficiency benefits from reduced information frictions. Okay, so this is just focusing on the favoritism side of things, or the animosity side of things. On average, the first paper tells us that the information benefits may outweigh those costs. Okay, let me, in the time I have remaining, let me talk about the Chinese Academy of Sciences and entry into the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And I'll probably talk about selection into the Politburo primarily as a way of providing a counterpoint or a point of comparison to selection into the Chinese academies. Okay, so we're now switching social settings. We'll have very different measures of social ties. And we'll again see that you have a diversity of effects depending on the particular setting you are focused on. Okay, so following earlier literature, note there's nothing about religion here. That's not a dominant consideration. There's much written on the role of home, place of birth, hometown ties, or rather ancestral place, college ties, workplace, and workplace overlap. In the context of science and who gets ahead in science, we like to think we have objective measures of quality. Okay, so citations and related summary statistic of H-index. And we will have I think plausible identification, which is the way the Chinese Academy of Sciences is structured is you have the so-called standing committee for each topic area. So the physicists have a standing committee, the chemists have a standing committee. And, what we'll take advantage of is people rotating onto and off of the standing committee and see who gets selected, who gets promoted into the Chinese academies, depending on who is on the selecting body. I'm gonna skip this kind of big picture discussion. It's making the point that hometown ties are important in China. There's many compelling anecdotes on this and lots of many papers on hometown ties. I think in the context of the current talk, maybe one relevant data point is that in recent years, hometown associations like meeting points for people from the same hometown were actually banned by the Chinese Communist Party because they were seen as kind of fostering corrupt favor exchange. Something else that I, just by way of background, the academies, the Academy of Science and the Academy of Engineering, this is not like you know, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, just some honorific. There are very substantial benefits, financial and otherwise, that accrue to members of the academies. So they have the rank that is commensurate with vice minister level officials. Given the resources that they control, universities compete quite fiercely to hire them. And as a result, even though the resources may be for research funding, it translates into, because of the benefits that that universities may obtain by hiring them, translates directly into salary premium. This is not a well-identified graph, but it's a striking one nonetheless. This simply has on the horizontal axis the number of CAS fellows at various universities. This is residualized in some way, which is why you get fractional fellows. And on the vertical axis is total government grants. And it is striking just how closely these are on the regression line. Let me skip this. Selection, you can kind of think about, I'm just trying to get to the main result. Selection is done by the so-called, by the standing committee, but anyone can nominate someone for election, and everyone gets to vote in the election. Something I'm not going to have a chance to talk about. So first of all, there's this nomination process. All nominations constitute our beginning sample when we look at who gets selected. There is a mail-in phase of voting, and then at their biennial meeting, they have an in-person discussion and vote. And what is intriguing is everything I talk about in the next couple of minutes comes from the in-person interactions. It's not driven by the written evaluations. Now, I should say that when we started on this project, like if we had written out a pre-analysis plan, it would have been that if you had someone from your hometown, let's just keep it simple and think about connections as being driven by hometown, we would have said, oh, it's going to be a higher selection rate than people who don't have hometown committee members, that don't share a hometown with a committee member. You see, and this is going to foreshadow what we see in Politburo selection, you see that there is a very sizable difference, which just disappears in 2007. So we discuss in the paper, though we were unaware of it when we started on the paper, they began to publicly post all nomination lists as well as the winners, those who were selected in 2007. So, maybe for another time, I'll be happy to come back and talk about transparency and whether transparency will be our salvation. In this case, it is interesting that making the nomination list public really led to the disappearance of this form of what I will in a moment argue as favoritism. Of course, it could have just shifted things towards a less visible form of favoritism. And maybe instead of voting for someone from your hometown, you instead vote for someone who paid you a sizable bribe. And there are lots of stories about that in the selection of the CAS as well. But at least this form of favor exchange seemed to disappear. And why do I argue it is likely favoritism rather than, again, better information? Well, for people who are not connected, there is a big increase in this observable measure of researcher quality between those who are nominated and those who are nominated and elected. Those with connections on the committee, there is no such increase. It could be that they know something about their future research trajectory. That's something we take up in the paper. Okay? In the end, it's hard to argue that it's soft information. Let me check the time. Okay, so social ties are associated with a large increase in election probability and disappearance of positive selection. And we argue that, again, we care about this not just because it's swapping who gets into the positions of scientific power. We care about it probably because we may have particular concern for the allocation of research resources that may have implications for innovation and thus long-term development. Going to very, very briefly talk about Politburo selection to conclude. And this is kind of a paper where, again, you talk to most people, including, this is work with my longtime collaborator, Yongqiang Wang, and a few others. We certainly expected the sign to go in the opposite direction. So what we are looking at in this final example is whether members of the Central Committee, okay, so you can think about that as roughly corresponding to, if you like, the Chinese legislature. So hundreds of members. Who among them gets selected for the 24 members of the Politburo? And we're looking at who gets selected as a function of connections to the Politburo. And we get a negative coefficient. Okay, and I'll leave the questions of identification to the paper. Let's just accept for the moment that there's a negative coefficient. That is, there's a connection penalty rather than a connection benefit. And so that's interesting, and you can think about why that might be. And it probably invokes a kind of richer set of theories than I've talked about thus far. And that's why I kind of wanted to finish with this example. Let me skip. There's so much that I think is interesting about this setting, but I'm going to have to skip over it all in the interest of finishing roughly on time. So first of all, and this is what I referenced at the very beginning when I said, when you're looking at stuff that is easily observable, it may have a very different impact than the stuff that people can't see. One reason, and we are far from adjudicating among these various reasons in the paper. We kind of talk about what sort of evidence there might be to support or refute these various possibilities. Mao and subsequently Deng and everyone thereafter inveighed against the evils of factionalism. Okay, so it's harmful to the individual and the collective to let things slide for the sake of friendship, because he is an old acquaintance, a fellow townsman, a schoolmate, a close friend, a loved one, or old colleague, or old subordinate. Okay, so one rationale might be there cannot be the appearance of this sort of factionalism. Okay, so if there exists a tie to an incumbent Politburo member or an incumbent Politburo Standing Committee member, you cannot have them selected for the Politburo. You can kind of think about various other possibilities, which again, we take up in the paper. It invokes a more nuanced set of organizational considerations. And again, I finish with this because it emphasizes that kind of just the simple cost and benefit that I started with is really doesn't do service to the kind of embeddedness argument that Granovetter was making. There's competition within these different factions or groups, between, so intergroup. And that has that may lead to some compromise that results in this kind of power sharing that leads to a connection, discount, or penalty. You can imagine the same implication of intragroup competition. If you are the Politburo member that represents your faction, you don't want competition from within the faction. You want to be the dominant member of the faction. So you can think of various explanations that might rationalize this. But that is quite, adds a lot of complication and goes beyond not just the talk I'm giving here, but very much beyond the paper that I was just referencing. So let me end with some very big picture observations. So the main thing I hope I've convinced you of, if you didn't come here already believing it to be true, social relations matter for economic outcomes, but not in some kind of simple, universal, monotonic way. There's a lot of nuance to how we might, and almost by definition, going through 5 papers in 50 minutes, I do not give much of that nuance. But I hope I've at least convinced you to think more about that nuance, and that kind of going to the very big picture of our field, if we're to think about exchange in markets, exchange within organizations, you need to consider the social settings in which they take place. And that is it.
Thanks, Ray.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's a very interesting talk. Let's see. So the way we'll do this is, I guess, so that, because we can't see each other as much. So maybe you raise your hand and then I'll allow you to, I hate doing this dictatorial stuff, but we should have some sort of a system. So those who want to ask questions, could they raise their hands? And then I will just ask you to go ahead. All right. So let's start with Dotuna. Dotuna, can you ask your question? So these are from the attendees side. So I request the okay, so till this is being sorted out, Sharan, can you go ahead and ask a question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
So much, Ray. This was a really great talk. Super interesting, kind of sparked many ideas. I just had a question on what your thoughts were about the strength of the ties. So there's one, you can think of ties being binary, which is in group or out group. You can also think of within in group, there's like hierarchy of ties. And I wanted to know how the strength of the ties kind of played into all of what you're saying and what your thoughts are on that. Do they kind of improve the information channel? They also kind of increase the favoritism channel. So then how does that kind of affect? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Do you have any particular setting in mind for this?
So
like, is there something specific that's motivating the question?
The way I was thinking about it was in terms of caste in India, for example. So you could be, you could be scheduled caste, which is a broad set of subcastes that are all put together under the classification of scheduled castes. But then even within scheduled caste, your subcaste could be much closer to you than others. So how does that?
Mm-hmm. So I do vaguely remember some discussion. Again, the paper with Vikrant and Daniel is many years old, so discussions around that paper go back many, many years. There's some discussion around, you end up with these very coarse proxies for the strength of these ties, like, for example, the size of the group. So you can imagine that if the group definition is simply general caste, then that is a rather diffuse form of connection, as distinct from, I'm trying to remember, Parsi, there was some variation. You could identify a Parsi coefficient because there was a non-zero number of Parsi loan officers, and the Parsi coefficient was much, much bigger than the general caste coefficient. But there are so many reasons why that might be true. So yeah, I think what you're saying is almost surely correct, but I don't know that in anything that we have done, we've really had any empirical traction on the strength of these ties. You can imagine just thinking about conceptually what you're capturing. You can easily make what is a binary variable into a continuous one.
Right.
It's just that you then need to find the empirical analog to this continuous measure.
So the next question is from Mudit. Mudit, can you ask the question directly, or should I read out from your chat? Well, let me read out from his chat then. So he asked, wouldn't religious, I think when he talked about riots, Ray, he asked, wouldn't religious riots affect the business environment? Businesses belonging to some religious group are more affected than others due to riots. Wouldn't this bias the results?
Not sure. So just to be clear, let's see if tempted to just like share a whiteboard to kind of emphasize the source of identification, which is you have two people who grew up in region A and region B, and actually you have people who grew up in, consider 4 loan officers. Never mind. It's too hard to kind of construct in one's head in real time what the right diagram would look like. But it's identified off of loan officers being born in the same place, but at different points in time, And because of their different span of youth, are either exposed to violence or are not. So you can kind of pull out the cross-sectional effect of, is this a place that where there's generally friction between two groups, Hindu-Muslim friction, versus a person being exposed to it because they happen to be 15 years old at the time something took place, whereas his counterpart had already moved on. So I'm not sure of the bias. And also to emphasize, they're exposed in the area they grew up, but then they're working for the bank in some completely different part of the country. So the business environment in their, where they are working is uncorrelated with the business environment where they were exposed to violence.
So I'm going to try this again with the attendees. So Amit Khandelwal, I've asked you, you can ask a question.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Hi, Ray, thanks for the talk.
Hey.
I'm curious if there are interesting settings that you know of in developing countries where you would get a null result on social ties. So you make the case that the direction can go either way, but then in your introduction you were kind of, I want to sort of know if I can rescue neoclassical economics in some way.
That's a good question. And let me give a facile answer and then defer a more of an answer to like after I've thought about it for a month or something, or maybe never. The facile answer is like, you could easily get these various effects just canceling each other out. So if that's what you mean by a null result.
No,
I know that's not what you mean.
Right.
Actually, let me give a different answer. So, and this kind of is very much in the spirit of the, were you exposed to riots in Gujarat or not? And your subsequent behavior towards in-group or out-group. There's a paper on, it's a kind of lab in the field experiment type paper on Rwanda and exposure to, I guess what I'll call government propaganda around reconciliation. Like to be clear, I'm not suggesting that's a bad thing that they're trying to bring Tutsis and Hutus back to have some peaceful coexistence. It also relates to the question much earlier of, are these constructed or are they destiny? And so, that paper suggests that if you are more exposed to the government message of let's all live together in harmony, you're more likely, at least in a lab experiment setting, to be harmonious with the person, to an outgroup individuals. So maybe that's the closest I can get off the top of my head to something like a null result.
Any more questions? Can I ask one, Ray? Sorry, I'll take the prerogative as the chair. We are approaching this issue of looking at social ties or social, groups and intra-group with a kind of an idea that we know what a group is, right? And that, in India, it's a particular caste and religion. Yep. But have there been exercises where we are kind of, ambivalent about this? So let's say that we try to do something what machine learning people do and ask ourselves that, let's say in your loan giving, experiment, if we were to ask, what are the kind of, if I try to group based on characteristics that I observe, are there particular configurations on which I see that there would be a positive effect? I could similarly say this about a negative effect, where we don't define groups, because one of the problems is that once you go to the field, many people tell you that, oh, well, it's not this unidimensional idea of, a general cast, it depends on various attributes. Have there been exercises where we try to, in some sense, ask ourselves, what would be the group definition to get a positive effect? Or what would be a group definition to get a negative? I'm talking about these marginal effects you get on borrowing. And what would be the group definitions on which you would get no effect? And then to look at them and ask them whether they look reasonable or we would have to go deeper there. Have there been
I thought you were going to ask a different question. The question you just asked, I think, is an interesting one. It necessarily entails a rich set of covariates that we would say kind of are, I think we would like to say, relate to the dyad. So I don't think we had that in our context, at least in the Indian banking context. The question that I thought you were going to ask was still about, we're assuming, and I think it's an interesting question. I would have to kind of, much as with Amit's question, need to think more about what would be the setting in which that would be at all feasible. Because I don't think any of the ones I talked about today would, they are all very small data exercises. And so I don't think you could do the sort of thing you describe. Thought you were going to ask something about, again, the extent to which social ties are a construct as opposed to a characteristic that kind of defines our relations and identities. And I was going
it's linked to that. I mean, it's this idea that we go in with predefined ideas of what groups are and how they're formed. And so I guess we are out of time. I don't see hands raised, so I guess it's not a binding constraint right now. So, so thank you very much, Ray. That was an interesting, kind of summary of your work and the ideas out there. And I don't know how this is supposed to work with the organizers. So am I just supposed to just, so thank you, Ray. But
my pleasure.
Thank
you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So should we just end the session, or is there something else? Someone should just pipe in.
Yeah, so Abhinav, I think we can continue if there are further questions.
No, I don't see. That's why I said it's not doesn't seem to be a binding constraint. I don't see.
I will also say it is so far past my bedtime that I'm probably going to fall asleep.
There is one raised hand. There was
okay.
One hand. David Wong.
All right. Okay, let's.
Yeah. So there are a lot of papers that suggest in-group favoritism, and but it seems in economics that only repeated game incentives are the basis for such favoritism. That is, you would favor your group if you're more likely to have repeated interactions with them in the future. So can we interpret your results as highlighting the lack of a priori greater basis for repeated incentives among those who are belonging to the same group? So yeah, I'm wondering what is the implication of your results for the literature on in-group favoritism, which seems always to find it.
Sorry, I'm not sure I follow, because there is repeated interaction within the broader community. Like there's nothing that I've said that would suggest otherwise. And I'm not suggesting that the absence of in-group favoritism. So
there isn't.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but the if there's repeated interactions, there may be more or less or no difference between the in-group and the out-group. And the literature seems to assume, this is my outsider view of it, that a priori, people favor those within their group. But as far as I know, in the theory literature, there isn't any basis for that other than a higher probability of repeated interactions for in-group favoritism. So groups matter only if you're more likely to meet those people in the future.
Okay, I understand a little better. I think this is like the same point at which Ostrom would have said that game theory lost its way, that it's such an it takes such a narrow view of social relations that they're defined only by, if you like, repeated games with trigger strategies, that it's a theory that only a game theorist could, I was going to say only a game theorist could love, maybe only a game theorist could believe.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. So I'd like to end the session here. So again, thank you, Ray, and thanks to the panelists and